You feel pain like no other pain, and you know that in your life it's going to be very difficult to...
The room did not erupt when the judgment was read. It went terrifyingly quiet. Camilla remained seated for only seconds before her face drained of color and her body gave way, while William stood frozen across the room, unable to hide what the words had done to him. The Supreme Court had just confirmed the unthinkable. Succession papers carrying alterations linked directly to the Queen Consort had entered the royal record. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William heard his name again and tightened his grip on the table. The succession papers, confidential documents setting out how royal authority and emergency responsibilities would be exercised, were not ordinary family notes. They touched the future king's position directly, and the court had ruled that 3 clauses were changed after the papers had supposedly been finalized. For the prince, someone had reshaped decisions about his future without asking him. Camilla tried to stand. She turned toward Charles, whispered his name, and faltered before taking another step. The king moved instantly, torn between reaching for his wife and absorbing what the judgment had placed before him. She had spent years seeking stability inside the family. Now the Queen Consort faced a ruling linking her to changes capable of shaking that structure. The courtroom language grew colder. The Supreme Court, the United Kingdom's highest court for major constitutional disputes, identified one clause as especially dangerous. It concerned who could exercise temporary royal authority during a succession emergency, meaning a crisis in which sovereign power could not proceed as expected. The original wording had centered William. The altered version created room for another hand to intervene. Charles suddenly stopped moving. A date was read aloud, and the monarch lowered his eyes before setting his glasses down carefully. William noticed. So did Camilla. No explanation followed, but the silence carried its own accusation. The king recognized that date, and whatever had happened then was not new to him. William looked from his father to the woman still struggling to steady herself. Shock was hardening into something more painful. If the papers had been changed, then someone had gained from the new wording. Someone else had lost ground, and the prince was no longer certain which side of that equation he occupied. The ruling had exposed the alteration. It had not exposed the motive. William had survived the shock of hearing that the papers were changed. Now he had to discover whether those changes had been designed to protect the crown or to move him out of someone else's way. Behind the constitutional language were 3 people confronting 3 nightmares. Charles feared his family had become inseparable from a national scandal. Camilla faced the possibility that every hard-won ounce of acceptance could disappear in a single judgment. And William confronted something colder: the possibility that his place inside the monarchy had been negotiated around him while he was still expected to smile, serve, and say nothing. William had been raised to understand that succession was never merely inheritance. It was the legal and ceremonial order determining who carries the crown next, and his adult life had been shaped around that responsibility. Every duty pointed toward the same future. Now the prince had to consider whether someone inside his family had quietly tried to reshape the terms of that future. Camilla carried a different fear. Years of criticism made acceptance personal, and the Queen Consort understood that the ruling could transform private conversations into evidence of ambition. Charles found her after the collapse, away from advisors and staff. She asked him one question: did he truly believe she had tried to weaken William? The king looked at her, hesitated, and that silence wounded her more than an accusation would have. Catherine heard the strain in William's voice before he admitted what hurt. The Princess of Wales listened as he said betrayal from a stranger would have been easier to understand. What he could not accept was the possibility that people he trusted had discussed his future without him. She reminded him that anger could wait, but facts could not. He nodded, Yet the future king still looked like a son trying to understand his family. Then one detail changed the temperature again. A sealed appendix, a restricted attachment kept separate from the main judgment, contained William's name beside a handwritten notation added weeks after the document had originally been approved. No public identification of the handwriting existed. That made the note more dangerous. Charles responded immediately. The monarch privately ordered the earliest version of the papers brought to him alongside the amended copy. When the aide placed both documents before him, he read one paragraph twice. Then he stopped. A sentence in the later version had never appeared in the draft he remembered approving. That discovery changed the question completely. The palace no longer needed to ask whether the papers had been altered. Charles now had to confront when the change began, who reopened the discussion, and whether the spark had come from inside his family. To understand why one altered sentence could tear through the monarchy, William would have to return to the night when a private argument transformed into a constitutional warning. Months before the court judgment, there had been one dinner at Windsor that everyone later remembered differently. It began with routine discussion about royal workloads, and ended with William pushing back his chair so sharply that the sound stopped the room. Camilla had raised the subject of emergency authority. Charles had tried to calm them both, but one sentence spoken that night would later appear, almost word for word, inside the altered succession papers. William entered that dinner wary of the subject. Succession planning, the process of preparing for who carries royal authority if the sovereign dies or cannot act, felt personal to him. Charles wanted continuity discussed calmly, while Camilla argued that emergencies could not be left to tradition alone. Catherine listened, because every theoretical scenario sounded beneath the careful language like a prediction about the king's weakness and the prince's future. Camilla pushed the conversation further. She said no single heir should automatically control every emergency decision, because everyone assumed the next step was obvious. William looked at her and asked whether she was talking about constitutional stability or whether she simply did not trust him. The Queen Consort did not retreat. She answered that the institution had to be protected from assumptions, and the phrase landed harder than she expected. Catherine watched William's expression change. The prince became quieter, then colder, while Charles tried to close the discussion before anger took over. It was too late. William stood, pushed his chair back, and told his father that his future should never be redesigned in a family dining room. The king asked him to stay. He did not. Weeks later, Charles learned why that argument mattered. A revised version of the papers contained language strikingly similar to Camilla's warning about protecting the institution from assumptions. The new wording replaced a clause that had centered William during an emergency. For the monarch, coincidence was difficult to accept, because the sentence had migrated from a private family dispute into a formal document. Then the memorandum appeared. It was a follow-up instruction, an internal written order used to reopen and review material previously treated as settled, and it had been circulated after the Windsor dinner. Charles read the routing history twice. Someone inside the royal household had used that argument as the reason to reopen the papers. William had not yet seen the name beside the authorization. Charles had. The king closed the file and asked for Camilla to be brought to him alone. The court had exposed the alteration, but the Windsor dinner revealed its emotional origin. Now Charles had to ask his wife the question neither of them could survive by avoiding. There were no secretaries in the room, no lawyers, no courtiers to soften the words. Charles closed the door himself and placed two versions of the succession paper on the table between them. Camilla stared at the pages but did not touch them. Then came the question that reduced decades of marriage, loyalty, sacrifice, and public scrutiny to 4 unbearable words. Did you change it? What followed was not a royal discussion. It was a reckoning. Charles pointed first to the original clause, then to the amended one. The succession paper, the formal document setting out how authority would operate during a royal transition or emergency, had once placed William clearly at the center of temporary decision-making. The later version created another path. The king asked how that language had appeared. Camilla answered that she had discussed continuity. Yes, but discussing alternatives was not the same as secretly rewriting a settled arrangement. Camilla's restraint broke when he repeated the phrase from the Windsor dinner. She demanded to know whether every private conversation between them would now become evidence against her. Charles did not raise his voice. He simply asked why words she had used over dinner appeared almost unchanged inside the revised clause. The Queen Consort accused him of turning years of confidence into suspicion, but the monarch refused to move away from the question. Charles finally said what neither had wanted spoken aloud. William was his son, his heir, and the future monarch. Camilla stared back at him and said she knew exactly who the prince was. Concern about concentrating emergency power, she insisted, did not mean she wanted to destroy him. The king answered that intent mattered, but consequence mattered too. Someone had changed the rules around William without telling him. Then Charles produced the reopening authorization. The routing instruction, the internal approval that allowed officials to reopen material already considered settled, carried Camilla's initials. She looked at it and stopped arguing. The Queen Consort admitted approving a legal review, but insisted she had never authorized anyone to rewrite the substance of the clause. Camilla then said something he had not expected. Another person had access to the draft after it left her office. According to her documented account of the internal review, the final wording appeared only after the papers moved beyond her control. Charles listened, but relief did not follow. Her authorization had opened the door, even if another hand had walked through it. Outside, William was waiting. Inside, the king understood that innocence and responsibility were no longer the same question. When that door reopened, Charles would no longer be speaking merely as a husband. He would be speaking as a king, forced to decide where private loyalty ended and constitutional duty began. Charles had spent his life preparing to wear the crown, but nothing had prepared him for the possibility that protecting it might require publicly separating himself from the woman beside him. William wanted clarity. Camilla wanted him to distinguish intent from consequence. The court wanted compliance. Yet when Charles finally picked up his pen, the real question was not whether he possessed authority. It was whether he could use it without destroying what remained of his family. Charles understood what the judgment now demanded. The palace had to restore the original succession language and explain how unauthorized revisions had entered the internal process. A regency arrangement, the framework used when a sovereign cannot temporarily perform royal duties, was too important to be reshaped through private influence. The king also controlled household access, advisory roles, and sensitive internal meetings. The court could correct the document. He had to decide what happened afterward. William entered without anger. The prince told his father that he was not asking for Camilla to be humiliated, removed from family life, or punished simply to satisfy public outrage. He wanted something harder and more lasting. No relative, however close to the monarch, should ever again be able to influence his constitutional position through private channels. Charles listened without interrupting. His son wanted protection for the institution, not revenge for himself. That restraint unsettled Charles more than fury would have. The monarch had expected William to demand consequences, but the future king refused to turn pain into retaliation. He simply asked his father to make the system stronger than the relationships inside it. Charles looked down at the order waiting for his signature and understood the burden clearly. If his son could separate personal hurt from duty, the king could not hide behind marriage. Charles signed. The order removed Camilla from all future internal discussions involving succession contingencies, regency planning, and William's constitutional authority. The Queen Consort would retain her public role, but she would no longer influence the private machinery surrounding who exercised power during a crisis. The decision did not erase their marriage. It drew a boundary through it. Then Charles went further. He ordered an independent review of every draft, handwritten note, routing instruction, and amendment connected to the papers. The review was meant to reconstruct the entire chain of changes, not merely the clause already exposed by the court. William supported the decision. Camilla was informed that nothing would be excluded. The first result changed everything again. Investigators found a second modification buried deeper in the paperwork. This one did not weaken William. It concerned Charles himself. What began as a crisis surrounding William was suddenly reaching backward toward the king, and the next discovery would force Camilla to face consequences inside her own home. The consequences arrived without shouting. A briefing disappeared from Camilla's schedule. A folder she normally received never reached her desk. Then an aide entered and explained that, under the king's new order, she would no longer attend meetings connected to succession, regency, or constitutional planning. She listened without interrupting. Only after the door closed did she remove her glasses, place them beside her, and realize that the judgment had changed more than her reputation. Camilla remained alone with the unopened folder in front of her. The restriction was immediate. She would keep her ceremonial role, but constitutional meetings were now closed to her. Regency planning, the process used to decide how royal duties are handled if the sovereign cannot temporarily act, had become forbidden ground. The Queen Consort understood why that mattered. Access had once signaled trust. Its removal now exposed how completely that trust had fractured. William received a different document. His office was told that the original succession framework had been restored, and that any future amendment would require legal review through several independent channels. The prince read the confirmation twice, carefully. For him, the safeguard mattered, because his future could no longer be changed through a quiet family discussion or a private instruction passed between offices. Camilla felt the consequence before anyone needed to explain it further. She stared at the folder she was no longer permitted to open, and understood that humiliation was not the deepest wound. When Charles later found her sitting in silence, she told him losing access hurt less than knowing he believed protection was necessary against her. The king answered softly that safeguards existed precisely because affection could never replace accountability. Then the review delivered something worse. Investigators found that the second alteration would have expanded discretionary power during a temporary incapacity of the sovereign, creating uncertainty over who could authorize key decisions before William assumed control. Charles read the finding in a documented briefing and understood the danger. The monarch was no longer looking at one clause. He was looking at a chain capable of confusing authority at the exact moment clarity mattered most. Camilla's role became harder to escape. The independent review concluded that her original request had reopened the process, even though the final wording passed through more than one hand afterward. She had not authored every change, but she had started the chain that made those changes possible. William now understood the legal story. He still did not understand the personal one. The institution had delivered consequences. What remained could not be decided by judges, advisors, or royal orders. It had to be settled between two people whose trust had been broken. William entered without an aide. Camilla had asked for the same. No folders waited between them. No lawyers stood nearby. And no king was present to decide whose version mattered more. For the first time since the judgment, the future monarch and his father's wife were forced to confront each other as two people rather than constitutional symbols. William did not begin with anger. He began with the one question she feared most. Why wasn't I told? Camilla knew the legal battle had largely ended. The institutional questions, meaning the formal issues involving royal authority, succession, and internal procedure, had been answered through the judgment and the palace review. What remained was harder. She admitted that after the Windsor dinner, she had authorized a broader examination of the contingency plan. The Queen Consort believed the system needed scrutiny, but she also admitted that William should have been told before anything moved forward. William listened until she finished. Then the prince said disagreement would never have destroyed their relationship. Secrecy almost had. He could have argued with her, challenged her reasoning, even rejected her concerns. What he could not understand was why discussions about his future were allowed to continue without giving him the chance to speak for himself. Camilla heard the difference immediately. His anger was not about being questioned, it was about being excluded. Camilla finally stopped defending the decision. She told him, in the documented account she had given during the internal review, that fear of another confrontation had shaped what she did next. After the Windsor argument, she chose procedure because procedure felt safer than honesty. She believed more scrutiny would protect stability. Instead, the Queen Consort admitted she had created the very instability she was trying to prevent. Then Camilla placed one final piece of evidence before him, a handwritten copy of her original request. It called for review, not the exact wording later inserted into the succession papers. The distinction did not erase her responsibility, but it showed that the final alterations went beyond what she had personally requested. William looked at the page and surprised her. Charles had already shown it to him. The future king had not come to discover whether she was guilty of beginning the process. That question was settled. He had come to decide whether anything personal could survive what followed. William did not offer forgiveness. He told Camilla that trust could not be restored by one conversation. It would have to be rebuilt through conduct, slowly and without shortcuts. Then the prince left to stand beside Charles before the nation. Their private conversation changed the emotional direction of the crisis. But outside the palace gates, the judgment had already become something far larger than a family reckoning. By morning, the scandal no longer belonged to courtrooms or palace corridors. It belonged to front pages, television studios, crowded pavements, and millions of people deciding what they believed the monarchy had become. Yet among endless commentary, one moment cut through the noise. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd fell briefly quiet as the gates opened, and William emerged beside Charles, neither smiling, neither speaking, but walking at exactly the same pace. Public reaction split almost instantly. Some focused on Camilla and the responsibility attached to her decision to reopen the papers. Others asked a more troubling question. How could material connected to succession have been altered without stronger protection? Succession documents, records dealing with the transfer or temporary exercise of royal authority, mattered because uncertainty around them could damage confidence at the exact moment the monarchy needed clarity most. Charles became central to the broadcaster's framing. The king had restored the original language and removed Camilla from future discussions involving succession and regency. Commentators described that decision as a test of whether royal rules could stand above private loyalty. William, however, drew even greater attention. The prince did not attack her publicly, yet he did not soften what had happened. His restraint made the crisis feel heavier, not smaller. Camilla watched the coverage alone. When Charles and William appeared together, the Queen Consort lowered the volume but did not turn the television off. She knew what the image meant. Father and son were standing side by side after a crisis that had placed her between them. She had spent years fighting to belong inside the institution. Now she was watching the monarchy demonstrate that continuity could move forward without her influence. Then one front page changed the public conversation. A fictional national newspaper printed the original clause beside the amended wording under one brutal headline, "The line that moved the crown." Suddenly, the legal complexity became simple. People could see that a few changed words had carried enormous consequences. Outside Buckingham Palace, murmuring swept through the waiting crowd until Charles and William appeared. Then the noise dropped. Neither man celebrated. Neither looked victorious. The king walked beside his son, and the future monarch matched his pace. That silence became more powerful than any statement, because it showed continuity without triumph. Yet one decision remained. The public had seen how the monarchy would respond institutionally. Charles still had to define Camilla's place inside the family, and William still had to decide what he could accept. Publicly, the monarchy had survived the judgment. Privately, its meaning would be settled only when Charles, William, and Camilla faced what could never be restored exactly as it was. In the end, the most important verdict was not written by the Supreme Court. It came afterward, when the shouting stopped, and three people had to decide what remained of their relationships. Camilla had lost access and authority. Charles had been forced to place the crown above his marriage. William had discovered that his future could never depend on private trust alone. What survived was not innocence. What survived was a monarchy forced to confront accountability. Charles signed the implementation order without ceremony. The legal settlement, the binding conclusion that restored the original succession wording and cancelled the unauthorized clauses, created safeguards requiring documented review before any future change could take effect. The king knew why that mattered. Royal stability could no longer depend on private understandings, influence, or the assumption that family trust was enough. Camilla accepted the boundary quietly. The Queen Consort would continue public duties, but succession and regency discussions were permanently closed to her. When Charles met her afterward, he did not desert her or pretend nothing had happened. He told her that marriage could not erase responsibility. She answered that she understood, admitting that her judgment had caused damage even if she had never intended the final alterations that followed. William met his father later, and the conversation carried no triumph. Charles told him he should never have been forced to question whether his own family respected the constitutional role he had spent his life preparing to carry. The prince answered that punishment would solve nothing. What mattered was making sure secrecy never became tradition. The king heard in those words something stronger than anger: restraint. William also refused to demand Camilla's removal from family life. The future king accepted that reconciliation, if it came, would be slow and earned through conduct. He would not confuse forgiveness with constitutional trust again. That distinction became the lasting lesson of the crisis. Camilla's collapse now carried a different meaning. It was not simply shock at a court ruling. It marked the moment she understood that influence exercised privately could produce consequences publicly, within the most protected family in Britain. The crisis strengthened William because he rejected revenge. Charles protected the monarchy because he imposed consequences on someone he loved. Camilla ended diminished in authority, but capable of accepting responsibility. And the crown survived because accountability proved stronger than blood, marriage, pride, or private influence. That became the final meaning of the altered papers. No one standing beside the crown can ever be permitted to stand above it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.